got too many lights on me right now. All right, so welcome in. Today we are here with Dr. Jeffrey Trask talking about reparations, both for I would like to go through, if we have the time, what they could look like on a municipality scale, a state scale, and possibly a federal scale. How those different what that could look like on each individual level. But if all else fails, we can stick to here state level and municipality level, because that's where I think a lot of the really interesting work has yet to be done. But go ahead, Dr. Trask. Go ahead and just let us know your whole spiel, everything that you got going on right now.
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Trask. My 9 to 5 is a founder and operation director for a clinic called the Champaign County Christian Health Center. We take care of people who don't have health insurance, who are underinsured, or who just like access to care. We provide medical, mental, and dental health care, along with free labs and medications. So that's my 9 to 5, and then my mainly volunteer work stems in regards to reparations. I am the founder of the Champaign-Urbana Reparations Coalition, which is a local group seeking to create a Champaign County-wide commission for reparations for African Americans. And we also perform different events and functions and educational opportunities and so on and so forth. I'm also on the statewide commission for Illinois. Illinois is one of 3 states in the country that has a statewide commission for reparations. It's commissioned by Governor Pritzker, and it's called the African Descent Citizens Reparations Commission. We conduct public hearings across the state, gather information from the public about reparations, and also providing expert leaders and testimony for people who know all types of things about reparations to share with the public. And then I'm also involved with First Repair, which is a national group founded by Robin Ruth Simmons of Evansville, Illinois. We're first city to provide reparations for African Americans in the tune of now over $5 million that have been paid out at $25 increments to folks who live in a certain part of Evanston for a certain period of time. And then I've also kind of got a little bit involved on the international level. I went to the last United Nations conference in New York
I
in
did see
April.
some photos of you at the United Nations on your website.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So that was great to experience, to see other countries around the world that are on the same page about reparations for anybody from the African diaspora altogether. And so that was a pretty nice experience too.
Excellent. All right. Well, I mean, I guess the first question is, what does, as someone who's so well versed in the topic, I feel like I did let you know I do come at this from a more conservative leaning perspective, but what does it mean? I'm going to take the words from the horse's mouth here. What exactly how exactly do you envision reparations happening? What form would you like that to take?
Yeah, so it's a really big question, right? And so I'll start by just kind of giving any kind of a framework of how I think about reparations that's pretty straightforward. Because we tend to kind of politicize the word. It's a very polarizing type of word.
I would
So
say it's a pretty inherently political subject.
right, right. And so I like to try to provide this kind of definition or kind of understanding of it rather. 2 main concepts. One is when you do harm to someone, you apologize, right? That's just a human thing that we've known since beginning of time, right? You do something wrong, you apologize for what you did wrong. The second thing is that in cases where you are harmed, you deserve compensation for that harm. An example I give is when I drive through Chicago on the highway and I see the billboards there, about half of them are attorneys saying, "Hey, you've been harmed in an accident? Can give me a call? I'll get you some money."
Yeah.
So those 2 concepts really make up what reparations to me is all about.
Mm.
There's a more kind of universal defined definition internationally with reparations, which includes 5 main components, which is cessation, which is basically saying the harms that are being done are need to be stopped, and assurance or guarantees of non-repetition. Then you also have restitution and repatriation, which is kind of the idea of making things right, at least as much as you can.
Mm.
Then there's compensation, which is the one that most people kind of hone in on, which is the financial aspect of being compensated for harms. Then there's satisfaction, which is kind of an idea of kind of addressing the ripple effects of the harms that were done over the last 500 years. And then last one is rehabilitation, which is the idea of trying to make people whole on the generational level. So that's kind of like the international definition of reparations, but I like to use those earlier two ideas just to kind of sum up in real simple terms.
Okay. and this would be specifically focusing on formerly enslaved peoples here in the United States, specifically focusing on black people, but there were black Americans who are the descendants of former slaves here in the United States. Getting them compensation, making them whole is your goal here.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different thoughts that people have. Some people are strictly about it's all about chattel slavery, and anyone who's a descendant of chattel slavery, that's who get reparations.
Hmm.
But there's also thought that those who are of black skin, who have been discriminated against, who have been harmed in different ways, who may not necessarily have been descendants of chattel slavery. Say if you're a black person who came to the country after chattel slavery, but you say you were forced to live in a certain part of Evanston during redlining. Well, you weren't part of child slavery historically, but you were a victim of redlining. So
I mean,
you
do you
can,
think that might be a bit broad, though? I mean, at that point, if you're going to say it's about slavery, but it's not about slavery, I mean, at that point, would you lump in, Mexicans who may have been not allowed the same opportunities in the wake of the Mexican-American War 150 years ago? I mean, would it be Jews who were not taken in for the Holocaust? I mean, how many other groups could fall under that then?
yeah. So I always say that if you are part of any group that has been harmed
Mm.
and taken advantage of or disenfranchised or any number of those kind of things discriminated against, I'm all for you getting reparations as well. I only have time to focus on reparations for African Americans because there's so much this is with that alone, right?
Mm.
But Native Americans have gotten reparations. We know people of Jewish descent have gotten reparations, still getting reparations from Germany and what have you. Japanese Americans have gotten reparations for the harm done during World War II in internment camps. So reparations is actually not a new concept by any means. That other groups have been harmed, and other groups actually have gotten reparations. Matter of fact, former slave owners have gotten reparations when
Oh
they
yeah. Oh,
they
handsomely.
that's
Quite
right. When they
handsomely for
outlawed
their
slavery,
economic
and
loss.
Abraham Lincoln was paying Washington D.C. slave owners reparations for ending slavery there. So,
Mm.
so yeah, reparations is not a new concept. It has gone to different groups over the years. So we're just trying to have the same thing happen for African Americans, whether it was chattel slavery or redlining, mass incarceration, Jim Crow era lynchings. You go down the list. And so, yeah, I believe anybody who's been harmed deserves reparations in some form or fashion.
Okay. Well, let's narrow in on the idea of making Black Americans whole.
Mhm.
What do you think that looks like? Is that the obvious form everyone expects reparations is a check, but what other forms could that take?
Yeah, I tell people all the time that reparations is limited to our creativity. Obviously the money part is critical because without the money, it's just talk, right?
Mm.
But what's also just as critical is the acknowledgement and apology of it, because without that, then you can't distinguish reparations from just good programming or for helpful programming, for good programs that try to help people in general.
Hmm.
So we want to always identify specific harms so that we can say this is why that check is necessary. Pretty similar to a situation where I give a scenario. If I was falsely imprisoned as a young man because of, say a cop, that was race based decided to lock me up without proper evidence. We know this has happened. There's been many cases of
Oh
this has
yeah.
happened,
Oh yeah.
right? So not a new story. So let's just say I spent 30 years in prison without any, justice there, and then finally after 30 years, DNA exonerates me, and I finally get out. So what's due to me? Well, I get a lawsuit, right? Again, we've seen this happen on a regular basis. Matter of
Mm.
fact, there's funds that are set aside for this kind of thing, and there's insurance that municipalities have for this kind of thing. And so let's say I get $2 million. So first of all, the $2 million doesn't even represent the full amount of justice that's due to me for spending 30 years of my life in prison. And 30 years of my life in prison means I don't have the family I have, I don't have the Ph.D. I earned, I don't have this health center that I founded. All the things that I've done in the last 30 years don't exist because of that. And so there's no amount of money that can really, you know, present full justice there. And it's only going to be a token of justice.
Mm.
And even though it's a token of justice, I still want it, right? I don't want to get out after 30 years and get $0 and be on my own after that. But also, what matters here is that it doesn't matter how I spend my $2 million for me to get it. It's not charity. It's not someone doing me a favor. It's not a gift. It's a token of justice that's due to me based on the harm that I experienced for being falsely imprisoned. And so I see the same thing collectively for African Americans. We've been harmed and unjustly just because of the color of our skin. And so we're due a token of justice. Now, how that looks can be many different things. I'll give you
Yeah,
one
that's
quick.
that's that's most of what I want to hear is what do you think that making America Black Americans' whole looks like.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, it's challenging to kind of think through what exactly that looks like because we're, for a lot of people who work in the reparation movement, we kind of dig in trying to make it happen. We often are challenged when we have to think about what's the world look like in a true restorative and reparative world. And it's a challenge because we haven't seen that world
It
ever.
absolutely is.
We have to imagine what that world looks like and try the
Mhm.
best we can to strive towards that.
What
And
ideas
so
do you have?
so one idea, I'll give you an example locally in Champaign-Urbana. There was a consulting firm that was hired to do a report about policing, right?
Okay.
And they discovered that of those people who were stopped by police officers, black people were twice as likely to be pulled over and stopped for traffic violations. It's not stopping to
I
stop sign,
100% believe that.
signal, right? And interestingly enough, it was during the day that this distinction happened, not during nighttime.
Hmm.
In addition to being pulled over twice as often, black people were searched twice as often as
Mhm.
though of those who were pulled over than white people. And then, interestingly enough, of those who were searched, white people were found with incriminating materials more so than black people were. And so we know this has happened. We have statistics to prove it. I think it was a significant amount of money that the city paid to get, to this firm to find this out.
Mhm.
So if you know there's a disproportionate number of black people being pulled over, unless you believe that black people just are the only ones who tend to not stop the stop signs and not use our signals, then there's a clear disproportionate amount of distribution of traffic tickets going on there. So my thought is, well, why not have a little fun at the county courthouse where you have to go to your traffic court, and if you're African American, you can tap into that fund to pay your traffic fines or your court fees or whatever may be the case to compensate those who may be disproportionately being pulled over than others. And again, we know what happens, that police officers tend to kind of camp out more so in low income neighborhoods where there's
Yeah.
tend to be more minorities present. And so just by default, they get stopped more often. I mean, if they decided to camp out at other more well-to-do areas, the white areas, you probably find just me people not stopping the stop signs and not using their signals there too, but that's not
Mhm.
where you camped out at, right? So
You think
since there is,
stopping police from doing that would be a good form of reparations?
yeah, so if you back it up even more and say let's change the way we do things, let's
Yeah.
change our procedures, and let's change the way we operate and how we monitor things. Absolutely. Or if we know that there's going to be an inherent unfairness if we're camping out these areas, keep that in mind in terms of how you decide who you stop and why and when. What I
Mhm.
mean? So yeah, that's a great point. So like, that's why I say reparations is only as limited as our creativity, because it can include legislation, it can include policies, it can include procedures and practices and all different types of things
Mhm.
to show some sense of fairness and justice.
What other forms specifically do you think it could take?
So for example, we've had a history of healthcare disparities in healthcare.
Okay.
And so African Americans have lower healthcare statistics on almost every disease category you can think of.
I
That
believe
stems
that. Yeah.
from, yeah, stems from a lot of factors, but some of it stems from inherent lack of equal treatment within the system itself.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. There's an article that talked about how respiratory machines that measure lung capacity and respiratory capacity, they were literally designed to have different settings for African Americans for years. And so, because of those settings were different all those years, those who would have been eligible for disability payments weren't eligible that were black, and then white people who might not have been eligible for disability payments got them because of this different settings.
Okay.
The study revealed that approximately $1 billion was not received by African Americans for disability payments because of that setting, and $500 million went towards white people who wouldn't have gotten those disability payments without that change of setting. So, since we know this history is there, this thing happened, hospitals and healthcare facilities can again, at the very least, educate your staff, right? Have mandatory trainings on racial bias,
Mhm.
because we know statistically also that when your doctor has more things in common with you, which includes anything from religion, race, gender, sex, whatever it may be, the outcomes for that patient are better. Why? Because that patient trusts that provider more when they feel like they have more in common and they're more on the same page about things. And so another thing you can do in addition to that training is being very proactive in making sure you have proper representation among your staff and your physicians and so on and so forth,
Mhm.
which takes being intentional. Diversity among companies and other organizations don't happen just by osmosis or naturally. You have to be intentional to make sure that you're recruiting in certain spaces and really looking at the need to keep your staff diversified. In some cases, you may have to have more funding available for people of color to
Mhm.
come to your facility because maybe there's your community is not diverse enough, and so people may not tend to want to go there unless they have some kind of extra incentive to go there. So there's lots of different ways you can try to change the scale so that people can experience more fairness and more justice in different areas. And again, it takes that intentionality and being purposeful about it. But it can happen. And if you do that in healthcare, you'll see the outcomes and better outcomes as a result.
Okay.
Um, and then again, housing, education. Education in our community is really suffering. Overall, only I think it's 15% of our kids are at reading level and 13% at
Oh,
math
they're
level.
they're horrendous across the
Yeah,
state of Illinois. I mean,
yeah,
they are especially bad for Black and Latino kids here in Illinois,
yes,
but it's bad across the board
yeah.
for
And
a
it's like
variety of reasons.
1.7% and less than a percent for Black kids in those areas, in terms of reading and math. And we don't even know like how many levels behind they are. We just know that's how
Mm.
many are not at level that where they're supposed to be.
The mayor of
Um,
Chicago is a Black educator.
right.
How does that even happen?
Well, here's the thing. So there's a combination of factors. One is what I was alluding to with the healthcare system. The same way you have injustices and not equal treatment in healthcare, you also had that inherently in education. But I would say for the education folks, they only have 1/9 of a kid's life, right? Kids are only in school
That's a
one
lot
ninth.
of that's a lot of a kid's life.
Right.
That
Well,
that's a lot of life.
but eight
That's
ninths.
a lot. That's over a decade.
Right, but 8/9 of their lives is not spent in school. So we got to think about how do we help dealing with that 8/9 so that the 1/9 has more of a chance, right? They need to do better with their 1/9,
Hmm.
but we can also, as a society, do better with the 8/9.
No, I
You know,
no. You see that's a fun. It's funny you bring up that point because I 100% agree with you on that.
uh-huh.
I 100% agree with you that that other eighth ninths when people are not in school is so core to building up not only a strong America but specifically a strong Black community because
Hmm.
family needs to be at the forefront when rebuilding the Black community these days. Do
Absolutely.
you think that reparations checks are the way to do that? Because personally, I don't personally think that that is what would solve the problem. I think there's a much deeper issue that reparations, though I again they can come in many forms. I don't think
Mhm.
it's a money issue.
Well, think about it this way. So what are going on in the 8/9 to make the 1/9 more difficult? Sometimes African American kids in particular are going to school without coats and gloves during the wintertime because they don't have the resources at home for that. Sometimes kids are coming to school hungry because they don't have food at home. If you can provide resources for African Americans due to the injustices in other areas and provide means like Evanston did with improving your housing situation, because now you get money for your housing. If a kid has a better environment to live in, then that can improve their chances when they go to school.
I mean, got to be noted, Evanston, Illinois is one of the wealthiest
Yes.
Chicago suburbs, one of the
Yeah.
wealthiest probably neighborhoods in America,
Yeah.
quite
Absolutely.
likely.
Yeah.
They were able to pay reparations, but I mean, when you're one of the wealthiest areas in one of the theoretically wealthiest states, does
Hmm.
that mean much?
Well, it's all relative though, right? Because we have to start somewhere.
Hmm.
Because I always tell people reparations is not a destination; it's a journey, right? We've had some level of oppression that started as far back as 500 years when the transatlantic slave trade first started. And so the dynamic started back then.
Well, not for America. I mean, America didn't exist for another
Well,
300 years.
1619 was when the first, Africans were enslaved here in the colonies and so on and so forth. So that's still a pretty
I
long
mean, that would have
period.
been the Spanish and the French, technically.
Well, yeah, up to a point, but
Portuguese, too.
when the colonies first started here, the British colonies first started here, they started with slavery, right off the bat. Matter of fact, there's people who would argue that the main reason why that Revolutionary War itself was fought
Hmm.
was because that the colonies wanted to maintain the benefits of enslaving people because they knew that Britain had outlawed slavery by that time, and it might have been just a matter of time for the outlaw slavery in all their territories across the world. And so the colonies were making pretty good money by having free labor, which is nothing I'd say real briefly. We talk about being the richest country in the world, and nobody would ever dispute that the United States is the wealthiest nation on the planet. Like,
Hmm.
that's just not even a argument for anybody. But how often do you actually hear people say or ask, how did that happen? Right? How did the United States, from being a brand new country in 1776, just popping on the map, go from zero, so to speak, to number two in the world by 1860, only behind Britain? How did that happen?
Very,
Well,
very well, very lucrative trading deals. Some very good placement, like geographically, as far as global trade, and also a massive slave network. It was a lot of things, but
and
slavery was very high on that list. Slavery is very
absolutely.
economically efficient.
Right. So you and I own grocery stores, and I paid my employees the 65% of typical labor costs. It was about 65% of your costs as an employer.
Mm.
You didn't have to pay your employees that 65%. I'm not going to be in business very long, right? You're going to be able to lower your prices so much more significantly than I can that I won't even be around. The United States was able to do that with the cotton trade, where they were able to produce, sell, and deliver cotton cheaper than anybody else in the world.
Mm.
And so to a point where by the time 1860 came around, 53% of all the imported cash, money from exports rather, came just from the cotton alone, right?
I believe all of that. I do still have to ask though. Does that mean that a check is what is going to fix that disparity in Black America?
Yeah, well, we often use checks to fix a lot of things. We use checks to,
But is it
uh,
right here?
yeah, well, opioid crisis. We had a lot of checks for that. We had a lot of checks for COVID.
Still rampant. Still a rampant problem.
Right, but would you say that because of the investment in opioid that crisis that we've had less people die, we had because the Narcan and stuff like that's been saving so
I
many
mean,
lives.
I did. It was only a few months ago. I saw a man on Trank for the first time here in Champaign. That
Hmm.
was maybe 6 months ago, and
Uh-huh.
that would have been unthinkable a while ago. I think a lot of these problems are actually getting worse, despite the checks.
Yeah, but I believe it would be worse than what it was without those resources. There'd be more people who would have died from opioid crisis had you not had the resources to keep them alive. And that's the case for lots of things. COVID, when we have trillions of dollars spent in the Iraq war,
Hmm.
anytime there's
Ukraine.
money to bailouts for banks, anytime there's this need for cash, we use cash to try to literally bail us out. So whether it
There's truth
works or
to that.
not, that's been the practice. So let's at least try to practice when it comes to reparations for that too.
Well, I
uh,
mean, I would personally say I would push back on that, and I would say we should. One problem could be said with the federal government is that the old saying, when all you have in your tool belt is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
right.
If we see a lot of these problems, such as black disparity in America, through the lens of federal government bureaucracy, everything looks like it needs a check. And I think they're perhaps finding more creative and cost effective solutions at the state and local level, local especially. I
Hmm.
think would go much further than continuing to have this debate about than continuing to push reparations as an idea, quite frankly, is
Hmm.
my hot take of the moment. I think it gets in the way, if anything, when in reality we could be putting into practice far more effective and economically cost effective, as well as actually communally effective strategies. But
Hmm.
we're continuing to talk about things like reparations, and it's become a distraction almost.
Well, I think it's a both and. I mean, I think that what you're talking about, I can totally agree with. But I also think that because the country benefited from enslaved individuals and other forms of discrimination over the years, there should be some financial piece to it as well, because this country greatly benefited in so many ways,
Okay, well let's talk
financially,
about ways
specifically.
other than the check that it could be. Because again,
Okay.
I'm with you. I haven't seen the evidence that writing the checks solves problems.
Well,
So
well,
let
would you
let
say, would you say that the folks in Evanston who have gotten $25,000 to go towards paying down their mortgages or fixing house repairs that need to be fixed,
Hmm.
or paying their monthly mortgage, and paying down their mortgage and all that kind of stuff, would you not think that they benefit from that?
I mean, I would assume so, yes, but I also think that many Chicagoans who had to pay, and Illinoisans overall, who had to pay additional taxes in order to pay that money, because it had to come from somewhere, that's a lot of people whose lives are a little bit worse off for a
Uh-huh.
few people in Illinois' richest suburb to have their lives be significantly better off.
Well, it does depend on where the money comes from. So I would agree with you there. But like in Evanston case, and we have to be creative in how we fund this. But in Evanston's case, half of that money came from marijuana tax sales, right? So
Yes,
it's on people
they chose to
buying,
pay back black people with marijuana sales in Chicago.
right? And then the other for Evanston,
Does that seem maybe a little odd?
well, the idea behind supporting African Americans with marijuana tax sales stems from the whole war on drugs and how devastating that was for African Americans. The whole state of mass incarceration and African Americans being disproportionately locked in prison for drug-related crimes. You know, every racial group uses and sells drugs at the same rate, but black people were targeted during that time frame and
But I
still
fail to see
are today.
how taxing marijuana in order to give money to the government, who will then give money to a private institution, who will then give money to, in theory, black Americans, if there's any left at that point. I fail to see how that is the most effective solution. Again, we're trying to help black Americans by
Mm-hmm.
taxing marijuana sales in Chicagoland. Does
Mm-hmm.
that strike you with a bit of irony, perhaps?
I think it's an attempted form of justice to some degree. It's an acknowledgement that the war on drugs disproportionately affected black people, and so therefore the benefits from legalizing the same drug that literally locked us up for so long should go towards African American communities. And there's agencies in the state of Illinois, like the Criminal Justice Information Authority. I can totally get the total name right, but
They have a
they
lot of acronyms.
yeah, yeah. So they get grants, and their grants come from marijuana tax sales, and they go towards various types of like anti-violence programs. Our clinic was able to get some funding by helping folks coming out of prison get health
Mhm.
care. You know, so these programs and those funds have kind of trickled down, if you will, to programs like ours that are actually on the ground doing good for people.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that's a fair way to utilize those funds.
But do you
Now
think
you
that maybe not collecting so many broad taxes, especially taxes that disproportionately might affect certain demographics,
mhm.
such as the sale of marijuana in Chicagoland, do you think perhaps just not collecting that money in the first place and leaving it in the pockets of Illinoisans would have been a better strategy?
Well, it all depends on who's buying marijuana, right? You know, typically at marijuana dispensaries, it's not cheap, right? So people who have higher
Increasingly,
income,
actually, yeah.
yeah,
With new dispensaries opening up all across Michigan, I mean, they legalized not soon after. They wanted the cut of those tax dollars.
uh-huh,
Every state in our border did, except Indiana, for mostly religious reasons.
right,
So
right, right.
it's less and less.
Right, but the you know again, those who are able to afford marijuana on that scale, you know, are generally not going to be us a lot of the cases in terms of African Americans. So
Is
I
that
just
true?
I have to look it up to be sure, but you know, if you just look at just basic, you know, income, wealth, available disposable income, and things of that nature to afford something like that, you know, black people have 10 cents for every dollar a white person has in wealth. You know, so overall, economically speaking, we're you know lot further down the totem pole than other folks are.
I mean,
But the
I don't. I think that I think there's a lot of African Americans who are doing well for themselves, who do go to. I think saying that dispensaries are too expensive for blacks is maybe a little.
I'm
I don't know if I would agree with that.
I would have to look at the statistics, but just generally speaking, anything that's more expensive in general, where you know African Americans are generally less wealthy and have less income than white people in general. I mean, just any luxury item, anything that's more expensive than other things. If you're part of a group of people who generally don't have as many resources, you're probably not going to be the main ones. You know, the majority of people who are purchasing those items, right? You
Mm.
know, if you have a Jaguar dealership and you're part of a group of people who are
You think
less,
black people wouldn't be able to afford that?
there'll be more white people able to afford it than black people. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
You know, and so again, I don't have the exact numbers there, but I think if we looked up, you know, expensive things across the planet and then see who buys them more often than other folks, I believe in almost any category when it comes to having wealth and resources, white people will be more likely to be able to afford those things in
Mm.
general overall than black people as a collective
And
groups.
again though, that is marijuana sales specifically within the Chicagoland sphere. Those
If
you don't
you want
think
to
that
target
tax could have
Chicago,
disproportionately affected African Americans.
yeah, it'll be something to look up. But I think there's other sources of revenue as well. Like in Evanston,
Mhm.
Another half of their reparations money comes from what they call was real estate tax transfers, where
Oh,
basically,
some new fancy term for property taxes. Yeah.
yeah. So when you sell a home, and of course you mentioned Evanston being really rich, but when you
Mhm.
sell a home that's over $1 million in Evanston, they have a tax on that, and that tax alone also funds another $10 million for reparations in Evanston, and then
Okay.
there's another $1 million that's been raised by the faith community there too.
Mhm.
Um, so
Well,
yeah, so
I'm
reparations,
certainly okay with the rich paying their taxes.
yeah, right. Well, some people clearly aren't okay with that, and that's
Yeah.
what's with this new tax bill that's coming up.
I
That's
mean,
a
do you
whole
think
nother.
that things like reparations could be an attempt by the government to just try to get rich people to pay their fair share?
If it was acknowledged that there was a sense of a racial unfairness about this.
I mean, that's at the root of it. That's at the
Well,
root of the
yeah,
reparations
and that's
argument
what I'm
is
saying.
racial
I
unfairness.
would say yes if that part was acknowledged, right? Because if it's not acknowledged, then again, you just go back to good programming or good policy or something like that. I think it's really key to have that apology and acknowledgement to distinguish that, to make it, that's what makes it reparations. So
Okay.
yes, as long as that acknowledgement is there for that particular thing, then yes, absolutely.
So would you
And
say that the
that'd
form
be
of
huge.
reparations you would? Sorry, one more time.
I said that'd be huge if you were to do that,
Mm.
right? You said we know that this country has created billionaires and millionaires off of the backs of
Including
the
JB Pritzker. Yeah.
yeah, and so we're going to make this fair again. We're going to properly tax these folks who've benefited from this system, and we're acknowledging that, and therefore, yeah, that's a form of reparations, totally.
Okay. I mean, would you say that your ideal form of reparations is an apology and a check?
An apology and a check plus whatever policies, procedures, practices, things we talked about earlier can be put in place that acknowledges the unfairness before
Okay.
and tries to repair that unfairness.
How do you think? What do you think is the best way to go about repairing that unfairness outside of the check and a written apology? What sorts of programs do you think we should be attempting to enable?
So I think a key part about reparations is hearing from the community that's been harmed,
Mm.
right? And it could be different for any community because every community has its own history, it has its own past of what happened to African Americans there. Um,
Absolutely.
for example, here in Champaign County, there are still race-based covenants that were in place over the years, and these are the ones that actually still have race-based language in them, where it says, in essence, you cannot sell, lease, or allow to buy,
Mm.
allow purchase of this property of anyone that is not of the Caucasian race. It affects about 757 parcels of land in Champaign, Urbana, Rantoul, and Savoy. And this is stuff that still literally is on paper today. And so there's a history of redlining, just like it is in Evanston here in Champaign, Urbana. If you look at the areas where African Americans generally live in Champaign, Urbana, it's pretty clear where the redlining was. North
Oh yeah.
Champaign
Oh
has
yeah.
been
Bradley
pretty.
Avenue was a famous race line for years. Oh yeah.
Exactly. As
Everybody
a matter
knows
of fact,
that.
there's a person who did their dissertation research in 1991, and they interviewed people who lived in that area in the 50s. Well, that lived in the area during the 50s, and some places didn't have any kind of plumbing, outhouses even.
Mm.
And they asked one person, "Well, how did you use the bathroom?" And the person was quoted saying, "Well, we just waited till it got dark." And so there's a history just here in this community of redlining. And then even present day things like when I advocated to fight against predatory lenders, the vast majority of them was on the north end of Champaign. So they're targeting African American communities to get
Mm.
these payday loans. With the state of Illinois allows an incredible amount of interest, like 404% interest rate on these payday loans and
Mm.
predatory lenders. And so different things like that exist in these communities that are been where Black folks have been kind of forced to live, if you will.
Mm.
And so I think you can identify those kind of harms like that they did in Evanston in that regards. And so there's examples of how we can address that. We can go down the list and again, and I was saying earlier, it's like it's all about what the community says. This is what we feel is the most pressing problem, and this is how we feel it would be best addressed. So we can come up with all kind of ideas that we want to, but we want to try to rely on those who have been harmed to come up with a solution to how to fix those harms. I can refer to that practice with the group I used to be a part of, and I still do workshops there sometimes, but it's called the Christian Community Development Association. And one of the founders of that is Coach Wayne Gordon, who's a white guy from Iowa who decided to plant himself in the west side of Chicago and Lawndale area now about 45 years ago or so. and he just wanted to try to make the community better. It was one of the worst areas in the nation at the time in terms of
Mhm.
crime and poverty and all that kind of stuff. And so the strategy though is to ask people who are in the community, what's the biggest problems and how can we start fixing them. And if I gave you 100 guesses, you wouldn't come up with the answer to what they said was the first thing they wanted. Because
Drugs,
this, well, I mean, in terms of
safety.
like how to fix it, you know what I mean? So they could have asked about education, they could have asked about housing, they could have asked about employment, all those kind of things.
Hmm.
But what came up first was that the women in the community wanted a safe place to do laundry. So the very first ministry they started was a laundromat. And since then they have a church there. They have a huge health center, Lawndale Christian Health Center, that has like 190,000 visits a year. They have a housing development corporation. They have a child care program. They have a college preparatory program. So they built things over all these years to improve that community. But that's where they started because they listened to the community in terms of what they wanted. And
Okay.
so the same thing has to happen in communities across the country to address what are the primary issues that you see are problematic, and what are the best ways you feel can help resolve those things. And so
Okay.
that will translate into programming, translate into legislation, translate into money and to do certain things and so on and so forth.
I mean, what if what the community says is less taxes for programs and more money in the pockets of the community?
Yeah, then I think we should try for that. Whatever we feel the community is communicating that they feel is going to be the best way to help repair harms that were done. And that's another thing I'll say about reparations, that, it's really important to be very specific
Mm.
about what harms you're trying to address. And,
Yes.
Evanston did it by outlining a specific, geographical spot in Evanston. They did it by outlining a specific time frame, 1919 to 1969.
Mm.
So you really want to be very specific as to what harms were done, when, and how, and then that way you can properly address them.
Well, I believe we actually started this out. You were saying this could be something that's incredibly broad. You actually didn't want to limit it to just people who had been enslaved, even.
Right. Hmm.
Well, I mean,
But yeah,
does that?
but you're specifying that the specificity comes into identifying the actual harms that were done, right?
Okay.
And then the
Okay.
creativity can come in terms of how you go about trying to rectify those harms.
Okay.
Hmm.
Um, let's go back. Let's go back to brainstorming some ways in which these things could actually what forms these could take outside of just a check. I think that's probably what's most important here, as far as fixing the systemic problems that we all want to see fixed in the
Hmm.
black community, in Champaign, in Illinois broadly. Um, how do you think we can go down? We can start doing things like getting black Americans into homes, lowering their grocery bills, giving them access to transportation. How can reparations start accomplishing those things?
Yeah, again, if you look at policies or practices,
Mm.
we know there's a disproportionate number of black people who are denied loans at banks, for example. Again, well documented stuff. So, what can we do practice wise and policy wise to make that more fair? Right? We can look at there's lots of regulations in the banking industry, lots of regulations, lots of different areas, right? So we can add to those regulations to ensure fairness in terms of equitable disbursement of loans and everything else that may be the case.
Mm.
And we can also have things that will maybe have penalties when things aren't done fairly. Like we know that people, when they get their houses appraised, that there's statistically there's a tendency for black people to have their house appraised at lower values, and if the appraiser thought the white
Yep.
people lived at that house, so we can look at those kind of things and specifically address it. And again, some of it may be in the form of, let's have these sessions for these people in this particular field to be educated about racial bias. Because a lot of people, they don't recognize racial bias.
It's
It's
true.
one of
I mean,
the,
I'll be honest though. I mean, as someone who's born and raised here, I'm fully aware of how deeply racist this area can be, and Illinois broadly, and America even broader than that. I
Mhm.
am fully aware of all that. But what if I just don't think that collecting tax dollars in order to pay for racial sensitivity programs is a good idea? I
Well,
think I think reparations should definitively be in a form that is not that.
well, you can also, evaluate these things, right? You
Mm.
can say, here's the status of where we are right now with this particular area. Let's just say we're trying to get appraisers to justly appraise people's homes regardless of their race,
Mm.
right? And so we can look at where we at right now, what the statistics are. Then we can implement these programs to infuse training and education, these other kind of factors for people in this area, and then we can do a follow-up post study to see if that behavior has changed.
Okay.
And if it's not, then we got to find something else and try to see if it works. But if it does work, now we are basically making that area of life more fair for African Americans, where they're getting the same value of the house that they would get if they were white. And so and to me that would be success. That would be restorative reparation type of work right there to me.
Okay.
And we can do that in many, like I said, in countless areas where we see these disparities exist, and then we can target how we want to approach fixing those areas, and then do a pre and a post test and see if it's doing it has an effect, and then those results will translate into dollars. If a black person is getting proper appraisal for their home, then they're getting that money they should have gotten in the very first place, right?
Yeah.
And there's your check, right? In essence, what I mean. So your check may come in different forms if you do things in a way that's more fair, and so on and so forth. In the business community, there is an attempt to try to make things more fair by having diversity goals. But in Illinois, unlike some other states, they made the goals. They made them goals, and that's opposed to requirements. And so what you see is, even though they have these goals in place to try to have the state of Illinois dollars be contracted to minority companies in a proportionate fashion compared to everyone else, it's dismally low for black companies in particular doing business with the state of Illinois. Why? Because despite these programs, you have ways that companies don't have to utilize minority contractors, or they have reasons that there's not enough minority contractors out there, or they're not capable of doing the work, or you go down the laundry list of things, and then they have a way to not have to have that minority goals if they have what they call good faith efforts. So they made a series of phone calls or sent out a series of emails trying to get African Americans or other diverse companies on their contracts. Even if they get nobody, if they did a good faith effort, they can still get the contract. And when you open contracts for bidding, it's always the lowest contract wins.
Yeah.
They don't open the bids and say,
Despite the fact that we're paying so much in taxes.
yeah, right. But they don't say anything about, you got this amount of money with this percentage of diversity fulfilled, and your bid is this amount of money with this percentage of diversity fulfilled. That second part doesn't happen. It's just the first part, And so if you're communicating to companies that as long as you have the lowest bid, what does it matter how much diversity you have on this contract, right? And so there are some places who control who gets the contract, and if they're very conscientious about this, they will say to a company, "Hey, you don't have enough diversity on this job." And keep in mind, even when I talk about diversity in the business world, it includes veterans, people with disabilities, people of color, and white women-owned companies. And so there's a whole nother issue with the white women-owned companies being part of that pool and that being separated in some kind of way.
Do you think reparations shouldn't apply to white women?
In the business,
they are a historically marginalized group.
I think they should, but I think what happens is that you have a disproportionate number of folks in that category getting the contracts, because again, white people in general have more resources and have more capabilities. And I, being an entrepreneur in the world in construction and other areas, I have personally seen at least 3 different companies who, in some way or another, is majority owned by a white woman, but the company itself is actually being run by a white man. So one case might have been it was a son where the mother owned it, had nothing to do with running the company, but the son ran the company, but the mom owned it. And so you had that particular scenario happening where, those diversity goals are kind of like the scraps of the jobs in first place, but then you got folks kind of digging into the scraps.
I feel like that might just be a larger issue of the corruption within Illinois' contracts being handed out. I mean, didn't Chicago just recently have a building whose construction got halted because their dumpsters were being run by the mob, or someone was mob affiliated who was running them? Like, it's the most.
I'm not in Chicago. I mean, I'm from the south suburbs of Chicago. I've been in Champaign since '93, so I don't.
Yeah, so,
really
I was born and raised here, so I mean, technically, sorry. So I always, the unfortunate truth. I try to keep my ear to the ground on what goes on in Chicago. Unfortunately, what happens here in Champaign tends to be a microcosm of the ills afflicting that region, because it's where the political decisions get made. It's the economic engine. It is where it's where the magic happens, for better and for worse, certainly.
Right. Definitely for this state, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so yeah, it's a lot of things that can be done in my opinion that are again not just it's not necessarily just a outright here's a check, but
Mm.
if you change the way you do certain things, it will translate into to a check in some form or fashion, right?
Okay, I mean, I would agree with that. I do think there are better ways to go about this. I think that I agree with you on so many things that African Americans are owed a certain debt for the work our ancestors did and for historic and systematized oppression leading from then all the way up until now, coming in various forms across time.
Hmm.
But at the same time, looking at things like how specifically the concept of reparations is pushed, how I think it often it gets in the way of when we are hyper focused on these big extreme solutions to a problem that is ultimately cultural and not ultimately,
It's partly cultural,
in
sure.
but is it in large part. I mean, there's not an amount. It's not mortgages that are holding the black community back right now. It is various things, most of which, the vast majority of which, are in some way rooted to the original sin of slavery and deep systemic segregation of African Americans for
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
But just don't I just truly do not believe the check in any way or mortgage assistance or things like that are what is going to fix it. It's going to be a lot of work on the part of the African American community working on ourselves, working on our families and our religious and cultural institutions and our political institutions. And
And I think that's true, but I think we need the check to help do that.
okay.
And again, you know, they were able to take advantage of certain things. So, for example, the GI Bill, right? We know that there was this disproportionate amount of folks, black folks, who did not get the GI Bill when they should have gotten it. So they weren't
Absolutely.
able to get home ownership and start their families and start building that wealth like white families were able to. So, so that's financial in nature, right? That's a financial damage, So I think that there should be a financial solution to that financial damage, right? And how we do that could be again is limited to our creativity and how we address it. But it started off financially. It should also end financially as well. I don't think we should say this group of people were able to take advantage of us financially, but then over here we got to fix all our problems without the money. You know what I mean? You
Yeah.
can't, one way and not the other, in my opinion.
I mean, I would agree with that to some degree. It's very interesting that so much of the state apparatus. I mean, I believe there was a when I was researching you before I asked you to come on and have this talk. You had there was a photo of you with Brandon Johnson, again,
Hmm.
black educator, mayor of Chicago, holding the I believe it was a Healing Illinois grant that you received for these reparations talks
Yeah,
that you've
well,
been
that those
having.
two
Which,
separate things. The Hill on the Grant was separate from the Mayor Johnson thing. The Mayor Johnson thing, I was
oh,
there.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I was there on behalf of other reparation leaders that he was acknowledging Reparations Day, and also kind of announcing the official approval of a Chicago commission for reparations funded at $500,000. Which again, their objective, their goal is to go through the city of Chicago history, identify the harms done to African Americans, and come up with recommendations to start repairing those harms. So that was what the
I mean,
Mayor
you can
Johnson.
drive through parts of the South Side and just see it. I mean, you can
Oh, absolutely,
you can look
absolutely.
at it. I mean, they just got done building. Building that big skyway, just going across all the worst neighborhoods they can find on the north side. I mean, it's
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
it's horrendous. It's shameful the
Right.
way they continue to Chicago continues to bury its deeply, deeply, deeply racist past is,
Oh yeah.
and
The
as does
segregation
Champaign.
there is
Again,
pretty
a
ugly.
microcosm of the issues up there.
Absolutely.
Horrible.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so the Hill, Illinois grant that you referred to was something that came through us locally through the United Way via
Mm.
a state program. I'm not sure what the original funding source was, but it went through the United Way, and then we got it from there.
Yeah.
And for us, that paid for. And again, to me, you almost say this is kind of a form of reparations because some of that money went towards two young African American women. One is a Ph.D. student at U of I that has helped us start to create a survey to collect information that I was talking about earlier. Identifying those harms that people feel are harm areas and what they think the solutions to those harm areas are. And it's also an assessment trying to get an idea about what people believe what reparations are, because we've seen that people are all over the board with what they think reparations might be.
Hmm.
So it gathers that data, and so that's her main job. We also were able to hire another young lady who coordinated the reparations town hall and has been doing some other things for us, including getting like endorsement letters for us building the local Champaign County Commission and so on and so forth.
It's phenomenal.
And you have this healing grant that helped two young African American women in their personal economic situation to do this work for us. And then the rest of it went to this event, which part of it went to our speakers.
Hmm.
One African American woman, Janae Relaford, who's the head of Kansas City Reparations Commission, who came up for to be on our panel. Robin Prouty, who is the head of commission for the St. Louis University Reparations Commission, who's a descendant of the enslaved people that University of St. Louis, utilized to do whatever they end up doing. And then Robert Spice from Chicago, African American man who is in the faith community, did talks about restorative justice all around the country in the education system, but believes reparations is a part of that healing process with a faith perspective. And so that money went towards getting them here, having them have a good experience while they were here,
Yeah.
and basically running that event. And so to me, again, we may not tag that as reparations, but in essence, that's the kind of thing that can create that healing because we're able to, inform, educate the community a lot more with this event, so that people understand or are more conscious of what we're trying to explain.
Okay.
And you have these resources going to African American people for the work that they're doing and trying to help with the cause. So
Okay. I mean, I do understand that, and to be absolutely clear, I'm not trying to pull some gotcha moment of, oh, you took this funding, I don't care. The grant money was there, you applied for it, have at it. I'm not trying to throw any shade here.
mhm.
But I do want to ask, I mean, well, what my point would be, my personal take on the situation would be that a better way of spending funds of that nature, as far as where and how the state hands out funding like this, I do not bemoan these talented, no doubt, young African American women who you're able to hire. That's phenomenal. That's great. They were able to, I'm sure they were able to build their portfolios as well for future job opportunities, which is great.
Absolutely.
That's
Yep.
generational wealth they're building.
Yep.
But could that money have perhaps better spent on businesses that are making money, getting young black entrepreneurs off the ground and starting projects that can then become financially solvent within a few years, or making more basic, again, much more financially more financial slam dunks as far as opportunities for the black community, as far as an ephemeral, you know, possible, reductions in your mortgage that could be your check at some point. Let's actually just take that money directly and just put it toward black entrepreneurs to start making money and rebuilding their communities.
I think that'd be great. I mean, I don't think we had enough money to do that.
No, well, I mean,
The money we had to pay these young ladies weren't enough to do what you're talking about.
well, I know, yeah, that's
But
that.
I do believe that should be it should be a both and thing. I
Mm,
think investing in entrepreneurship for African Americans is huge.
mm,
It is a tough go out there. I mean, it is it's difficult from getting into it. Even when it comes to being certified. African American companies, any diverse company has to go through a certification process, right? Not an easy process, and it takes, fortitude and social capital and
mm.
knowledge to even get through that process. And that process could be delayed and take a long time due to lack of staffing on state levels for people who run these programs. And so you have those barriers, and then you have the barriers that you have to deal with when you're out there in the world that is predominantly controlled by not us, right? And
Yeah.
all hiccups there. And so I'm a huge believer that we can find ways again. Reparations can be so many different things in the business world beyond just a check. A check is again is important because I can use a check to pay to get me an estimator for my traffic control company, and it will have huge dividends in terms of me being able to be a successful company with traffic control. And so yeah, that check would definitely fit nicely, but There's so many other things that could be looked at to try to make things more fair. If we just do that part, it could translate into those checks, because if you can have a more fair existence, you can have the ability to get more business. You have the ability to raise more, to earn more revenue in your company, and do those things that you want to do, or get fair access to capital, right? Be able to have the same kind of access to get funding when you need to do things to build your business, to enhance it, to survive, whatever it
Yeah,
may
yeah,
be.
absolutely,
You know what I mean?
absolutely.
So there's lots of things that, again, if we, had restorative reparation type work within our banking system, where again we're looking at those numbers, and when we see those numbers and that proportionate the way they should be, so that's a problem, right? If we got the same credit scores and we got the same everything else, and yet there's still a disparity there, what's going on, right? And then let's look at that. Let's dig in. Let's discover some ways that we can address it, measured before, measured after, and see if what our means of trying to address it, see if they worked or not. If they didn't, let's try to find another way. If they did, great. Let's keep it moving. Let's keep making this thing more fair. So yeah, I think there's lots and lots of ways to do it, and I think having entrepreneurs in the Black community to be able to build up the Black community from being successful businesses is a great way to build, rebuild that wealth that we've lost, in the first place. And then again, the reason why, again, I'll go back to this money thing. There is a family called the Bruce family in California. I'm sure you might have heard that case where they
I
lost
have
their
not
land.
actually.
So there's a Black family that owned land in California coastline in 1924. It was taken away from them by the government, from false pretenses or whatever the case was. 100 years later, 2024, they win a lawsuit and get their land back. Right? They hadn't had it for 100 years. Now the land is worth $20 million. Right? So they get it back. So yay! Right? Justice in some form or fashion has occurred here, because after 100 years, this family got the land back that it should never been taken away in the first place. However, there's another family historically that did similar things that the Bruce family was doing in 1924, providing a California coastline area for families to vacation and have place to relax and so on and so forth. And their last name is Hilton. And so I often talk about these things of like what are the could have beens that were missed out on. I'm not saying that the Bruce family would have necessarily been the Hiltons, but maybe, right? We'll never know. It's the same way the things that I wouldn't have done if I was locked up in prison for 30 years, that we wouldn't never know what I could have done, but we did see what I did do in that time frame. And so, that money part is critical, because who knows what was lost. And not to mention 100 years not having your property. There's just getting your property back is not compensation for not having that property for 100 years, right?
Yeah.
Matter of fact, one of the things that California actually passed in their reparations task force bill was getting your land back if it was taken away from you. We too bad we got to have a bill for that, but that was one of the more less controversial things that they actually got on the books and actually passed, as opposed to some of the other things that didn't get on the books on the floor at all. But yeah, so that's why the money matters, because on the back end there was lots of loss, right? Financial loss specifically that took place, and so why not, rectify that financial loss with financial gain, and again, we can figure out how to best do that makes sense for everybody. And speaking of which, I think that when we do that, when we do reparations for African Americans, for any group really, that we ultimately do help everybody. If we found ways to have less Black people be locked in prison, for example, have more Black people educated and not end up in the prison, the pipeline system,
Absolutely.
I guarantee you that's going to save everybody money in the tax system, in the jailing, the prison system, and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah. Well, what if the best way to stop Black Americans from ending up in that prison pipeline is not overtaxing families?
Yeah, and also
in the first place. I mean, again, I mean, it just strikes me, and I'm sorry I misidentified that photo of you and Johnson, but it does at least convey a sense to which it feels as if the government itself wants us focused on these somewhat over-the-top solutions, as opposed to working on more realistic stuff we could do on a much smaller scale that would be incredibly cost-effective. I mean, we could work on those instead. It doesn't take as much money as you might think to help start fixing urban blight. To turn an open field. It's hard not to grow things on a field in Illinois dirt. You
Yeah,
know,
right.
like how much does it really take to turn a stretch of uninhabited land, an uninhabited lot,
Right. A
into a
garden.
half decent, a community garden, a park,
Yeah,
a place
absolutely.
where Black Americans could perhaps learn how to grow some of their own food as opposed to having to
Absolutely.
buy it. You know,
And be healthier as a result. Because another
absolutely,
problem.
absolutely, 100%. I am all for that small scale homesteading. I'd love to see more of that, both
Hmm.
especially down here, but even up in Chicago. I think there's so many good areas for it, especially in some of those bad neighborhoods. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, how what it feels as if the reparations it's a great idea, but there are so many good cost effective solutions that don't require a check. Again, to fix urban blight, you could
But
there's some
here's an example of the check that just for your idea, the community garden.
okay.
If African Americans who are in these low income areas barely paying their rent, maybe resources can go towards buying the seeds, right? Maybe resources can go towards paying someone in the community to maintain the farm. There's just different ways to utilize funding to actually make those kind of ideas happen, but it does take some funding,
Well,
right?
is it all about funding though? I mean, this is Illinois. This is the place where everything marches to the beat of the budget. I mean, everything is it's all it feels as if maybe we're a little too obsessed with just the money here, and we're ignoring, and because there's money on the table at all, we're ignoring very real solutions that could be right in front of us. Seeds aren't that expensive. You know, setting up some planter boxes using some old milk crates, which are all around impoverished black neighborhoods, and a few garbage bags wouldn't be that expensive, especially when you have community help. And there's a lot of unemployed people around in Illinois right now who would love the chance to start working on a project if there was real
But
community
would you give
development.
compensation to those unemployed people so they have a way to eat? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I
Because
mean,
they
yeah.
get
I mean, I'm
you make
sure
some
the
vegetables, but
ability to
you
grow
can't
their
eat.
own food would be great when they can't eat.
Right. Well, but you can't. If you have a community garden, you're not gonna get your full diet from some vegetables. So you got to have other means to buy milk and whatever else you need to buy too, bread. So you're not gonna grow those things in the community garden. So again, resource matter. And again, I'll go back to the fact that the financial gain that this country has had because of the discrimination, because of the enslavement, because of those kind of things, is like why exclude financial benefit for the solution when the visual problem came from the financial gain that people got because of the disenfranchisement, because of the discrimination, because of the racism.
I think I can answer that actually. I think I can
Financial
answer
gain.
why I think the finances specifically are a bad idea, and
Hmm.
it's because it eliminates when you have the concept of somebody from above can just write you a check. It does eliminate a certain sense of personal entrepreneurialness, which the black community is extremely strong with
Yeah.
when it
So
wants to.
So I think what I've and correct me if I'm wrong, but I get a sense that you're kind of alluding to this idea of empowerment and this the kind of dignity piece that if you're earning things you're on your own versus being given something, it makes a difference. And I've heard
I
that.
mean, in 50%, I'd say yeah. There's some of that classic Republican bootstrapping. Yeah, I'll be a bit of a stereotype. Why
Okay.
not? But at the same time, there is also a sense that when these laws, specifically such as laws that the laws that created the American suburbs, the white specifically American suburbs, a lot of those, that was wealth that was given to these individual communities, families over the course of a 30-year mortgage. Yes, it was significantly cheaper that back then, but this was money distributed over 30 years.
Hmm.
I mean, it was more about at the time, in the moment when these bills were being signed, when the money was being handed out. It wasn't handed out in the form of cash necessarily. It was a 30-year loan. That is a very large and expensive loan. Even inflation, and being taken into account.
Uh-huh.
It's not the 1950s. The dollar is worth significantly less now, but even so,
Hmm.
that is, it that changes people. When they receive steady support and good paying jobs over the course of 30 years as opposed to getting a check now that you'll probably blow at approximately the rate that you receive the money. I
Well,
mean,
but if you can, you know, if you got equal access, first of all, if you have equal access to those loans you're talking about, where
mhm.
black folks had the same opportunities to get those loans as white people, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in the first place,
That's
right?
true.
Because
That
they
is
will,
true.
they will have that because they say 30% of that wealth gap, that 10 cents to every dollar, in terms of
Mhm.
wealth gap, 30% of that is due to the housing discrimination and the inability for these laws to provide the same kind of access to African Americans that they did to white Americans.
Mhm.
So you already close the gap 30% if you just do that fairly. That's not a check. That's just fair access.
Okay, well,
You know what I mean?
why don't we work on that and then we'll worry about the checks later? I mean, I think the first step toward good governance is for both sides to come together, identify first and foremost what we agree on, and then say, let's work toward that.
Mhm.
And
Well,
then
to
we'll worry
answer,
about the stuff we disagree on later.
right. Well, to answer your question, the reason why we need to address that check wise is because there was a loss there when that discrimination happened,
Mm-hmm.
right? That 30% that could have been not existing, that gap of 30% would not exist in the first place had that wrong not been done, right? And so now we need to rectify, we need to do something to specifically address that wrong. If we just say, well, let's just do it right here or now, we're not even acknowledging the harm that was done when we weren't doing it right, right? So that's what we're talking about with reparations. We have to address that wrong. We have to
Mm-hmm.
address that 30 years in prison wrongfully, being in there in some form or fashion, because just starting from scratch here, that's like saying let's get a fair 100-meter race and our opponent is going to start at 30 meters ahead of us and
Mm-hmm.
then we're going to try to run the same race. We need to find a way to get the starting point back where it should be, and that can only be done by attempting to rectify the wrongs that were done in the past.
I personally don't think it looks good for the black community for us to demand that an opponent cripple themselves for our sake.
Well, it would be crippling themselves. It will be saying, you shouldn't start 30 meters ahead on a 100-meter race.
Mm-hmm.
So come on back to the starting point where you should be, or get us to that 30-meter line where you are as well. So we're starting at the same place,
Okay.
right?
I mean, do you think there's any truth to the argument that it's not specific, that those issues are an issue, such as the inequitable access to home loans, whatnot, other examples? That I mean, again, that's what about the argument that those are one piece, but that black people have some deeper seated issues that we need to work for before we start really contemplating something like this, something like
Okay.
a check.
Well, and let's look at those deeper seated issues. Where do those come from? So you got to think about the traumatic effect of, first of all, families being separated, starting way back to the transatlantic slave trade, right? Where you had regular communities, people like living in regular homes, just like we are right now, who are relatives and community leaders and regular folks,
Mm-hmm.
and then someone comes and takes a third of them, right? So you had that harm that's done there, and then that third that gets taken ends up going through this horrible voyage, and then when they get to where they get into, they go through this horrible existence there, and then families get separated again,
It's true. I
while
mean, I
they're
will.
there.
I do want to say though, I don't think. I think it would be wrong-headed for us to demand compensation based on the scale of what happened necessarily. I think it's more effective for us to demand compensation in whatever form is best able to help our communities. And I
Okay.
just don't think that the check is that thing.
Yeah, and again, I think the check is, again, it goes back to the specific harms that were done and how you fix those harms best. I believe that most any solution you come up with, now some solutions are price, there's no cost, right? If you change a policy
Mm-hmm.
and in legislation, that's zero cost, right?
Yeah.
Um,
There are a
but
lot of really good zero cost solutions that we could be implementing,
absolutely.
especially as I said, this is why I wanted to really zoom in on like the municipal scale. On that
Mhm.
scale, there's a lot of like low cost to free things we can do to help out black people today. You know,
Right, no
there's a
question.
lot of great things we can do.
And I totally agree. But I don't think we should exclude the check part because, again, there was a financial loss in the past that,
Mm.
again, if someone robbed you, you can sue that person for that theft. and you can seek damages on a civil case for restitution for those damages,
Mm.
right? That's a really commonly held principle of how we conduct business and life in our world. And so again, the argument just extends the same thing when it comes to African Americans. There's been damages, and we just want to have that civil case, if you will, of being able to get restitution for those damages of the theft that took place.
But I think
Theft
that
of
that
all kinds of
restitution
things.
doesn't. But should that restitution come in the form that is the most that gets us the most money in the form of cash or a check, or should it come in the form that's going to most help the African American community?
Well, yeah, but we don't know exactly what that looks like, right? Because we only have like one example of Evanston and a couple other things that happened recently to even see what happens when people get that check. So we don't even know, empirically speaking, what the best way is, whether it's a check or not a check, right? We can only speculate
Well, we can
that.
look at individual places within the United States and whose black communities are achieving the most. Chicago and Champaign, again microcosm, you
Mhm.
know, pretty historically bad, despite the
Right,
fact that our government openly pushes for reparations despite not actually paying them, except in the richest suburb. The
hmm
only one that ended up having to pay them, despite the fact that the mayor of the largest city in Illinois openly supports reparations, and it
right.
doesn't happen, and black people are terrible in his city. We had
Well,
a black they had a
well,
black mayor before him, Lori
it just
Lightfoot.
it just started. I mean, because the commission just got formed. They actually just closed the application process for people who's going to be on the commission.
Hmm.
Because that's another thing that's important to understand. People talk about commissions all the time, but why? Well, commissions are that vehicle in which you do the research, you identify all the specific harms that were done, and then you get community input and public input to address those specific harms that were done. That's what the commission's job is. That's why we're pushing for a commission here in Champaign Urbana, because that's that first step. And so unfortunately Chicago hasn't taken that step until now. Right? But it is a significant step, because at the very least, it's starting to acknowledge that this step needs to happen. Let's identify what might be the best solutions to deal with all this mess
Hmm.
that exists here. And so granted, we're way behind where we should be with a lot of these cities doing it now, but at least we're starting to the process. We're at about what 32% from one article said about those who are for reparations versus 68% against reparations.
Hmm.
Which is,
That's not a great margin politically.
but as high as it has ever been in history. And so we're trying to move the needle in a positive direction. And things don't happen right away. Like,
Hmm.
you know, once upon a time, people thought enslaved people having people enslaved was a perfectly fine idea. It was a very normal way of life, way of living. And then somebody somewhere along the way said, you know what, maybe enslaving people and treating them like, subhuman is not a good idea. And then after about 80 years, most of the world came to that conclusion. We
Hmm.
still had about four countries. Well, Cuba, I think it was, or Brazil, somewhere like that. The United States, obviously, the Ottoman Empire that was still in existence at the time. There's like four entities around the world that was still practicing slavery in that form. By 80 years later, after the first person said, you know what, maybe this is not a good idea.
I mean, the
Um,
transatlantic slave trade is shut down, but I mean, there are various forms of human trafficking for labor,
right,
sharecropping, and
right,
genuine concentration camps happening in various places around on Earth as we
exactly,
speak. I
right,
mean,
right. But we all acknowledge them as being bad. Like,
we do.
uh, once upon a time, there wasn't that general acknowledgement that enslavement was a bad thing, that this was just a way of life, right? And then the
I mean, yeah,
countries
societies
gained a level of
come and go to
consciousness.
it. Again,
Yeah,
slavery is very economically efficient. Societies tend to come and go on the idea of it, unfortunately.
right. So, but even the child labor that we see in other countries and other things that are happening, most people will say that's not good. You know
Yeah,
what I mean? Like, just generally in terms of the
most
system that
sane people would. Yeah, 100%.
right. And so I'm saying that wasn't the case with enslaved people back then, and it took 80 years to get to that place.
Mhm.
Um, and so I say that to say that same thing with civil rights and other movements. These things don't happen right away. It was, from Rosa Parks 1955 sitting on that bus till 10 years later to get legislation passed to have some type of equal rights and voting rights and so on and so forth. So things don't happen right away. Um, I actually like to see reparations move along the spectrum like marijuana has.
Mhm.
It wasn't that long ago that marijuana was clumped into all the bad drug, quote unquote, bad drugs
Mm.
that you get arrested for and spend jail time for, along with heroin, cocaine, marijuana was right in that category. In a relatively short period of time, however, the narrative changed, right? To a point now, we have dispensaries all across states that are legalizing this, where
Yeah.
you just go down the store and buy some, right? And so
I
I
mean, do you think
believe,
those dispensaries are used by African Americans?
well, again, not to the degree that I think folks with more money will use them. Because they say word on the street is that it's still expensive, so a lot of folks still try to get it, on the back end, and not
Mm.
through the stores, right? Because it's too expensive in the stores. But in any case, that movement of the marijuana sentiment change, give maybe Snoop Dogg some credit. Who knows how that narrative changed so quickly? But now they're talking about maybe even legalizing on the federal level at some point in time because 60-some% of the population believes marijuana should be legal.
To be clear,
And
I'd
so
love if my tax dollars went toward evaluating what effects Snoop was it Snoop Do double G had on
yeah,
civil
right,
rights. I would love my tax dollars to go there to studying that.
right.
100%.
But but I'm trying to get the narrative to change in the same way that it changed for marijuana in that time frame where reparations is not this kind of fringe, polarizing, crazy notion, but again, it just speaks to a regular sentiment of concepts that we have of think were are true and real for eons. Apology and compensation for harm. If we can just kind of get that through everybody's mind, then we can start addressing some of the other issues. A lot of things you hear is what happened way back then. So, how should we address it now because it happened so long ago? Does history really matter? And of course, most historians will say yes, history matters. How we live today has a lot to do with what happened in the past.
Yeah.
Some one day somebody, some banker more likely, came up with the idea of we're going to do home ownership like this. We're going to create this whole mortgage thing where people pay on a house for 30 years, end up paying 2.5 times the value of the house by the time it's all said and done.
Mm.
Someone made that up. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
They
I
could
mean,
have done
yeah,
it
I mean,
today.
financial institutions do get a certain leeway. Certainly, there's a lot of creative accounting that goes into that. But at the end of the day, what really matters is are our financial and government institutions trying to day by day enact solutions that are the best opportunity for Americans, and in our cases specifically, as we're talking about today, Black Americans.
Hmm.
And the checks haven't worked for most any demographic here in Illinois. We're one of the most overtaxed states. There's taxes on everything. Not every state has a tax on food. I feel like a lot of Illinoisans forget that. Not every state has taxes on food,
Yeah.
you know.
Hmm.
And yet, drugs are out of control. Heroin was destroying Illinois and large sections of this area long before fentanyl rolled in. Now it's just gone up to 11. Um,
Right.
we are opening all these offices, all these new programs, and yet things are getting worse. Our small businesses are being replaced by gambling parlors.
Mm.
We are paying bureaucrats to put band-aids on bullet wounds in our community.
Yeah.
Um, I just feel like there are better solutions and better uses of our money, and a lot of that starts with seeing what money we need to collect in the first place. I mean, if we could just leave tax dollars to go back to Evanston, perhaps I think there probably more than likely were quite a few African Americans using those dispensaries who actually would have preferred to
Actually,
just keep that money as opposed to it going to reparations for 16 people, specifically 16 people who live in the richest suburb of Chicago, or one of them. I'm not going to claim anything, but one of the richest neighborhoods in America.
well, it's more than 16 people. They're over $5 million in disbursements at $25 increments. So
Okay.
it's definitely gone to more than 16 people. Um, and again, it's a matter of again, we still need, in my opinion, have yet to discover what the best ways are. Like because we don't have enough empirical information to know what that is yet. We have to start trying some stuff, evaluating some stuff, and and then seeing, okay, let's see what works best. And I'm all for. I'm a researcher. So I get my PhD. I'm all for finding what is the best way empirically to make
Okay.
this happen. And we haven't even touched the surface, in my opinion, about what that looks like yet. And we have to just start experimenting. Have to start trying different things out and seeing how it results from zero cost things to financial related things and see where it goes.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this country has benefited financially, specifically financially, from all the discrimination and everything else that has happened over the past, enslavement and the whole nine yards. So I don't think we should necessarily just rule out that financial compensation. Again, how we do that is still something we have to discover and how to do best. But I don't think we should rule it out just based on not having that evidence of how we might be able to utilize those funds.
Mm-hmm.
And um, it's going to be different for every community. I know Evanston is already looking into other forms of reparations for their community now, and trying to venture beyond the housing aspect of it. And again, you got I think it's Asheville, North Carolina. I think they got about $5 million approved to go towards reparations now.
Mm-hmm.
Shelby County, where Memphis, Tennessee is located. They don't label it specifically reparations, but it's basically a reparations type fund of $5 million there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's start seeing where this money goes, how it's changing things, and see how we can best do it. But this is so much to work through. It's
Mm-hmm.
not going to happen, right away. I mean, we're people kind of equate it to a Monopoly game where you're playing Monopoly and someone has 400 years of turns of going before you can take your first turn,
Yeah.
right? So it's going to take a while, and it's going to, and that's why I always tell people, is like, this is a journey thing.
It's true.
By
But
no
but if
means,
there are solutions we could enact that could help us today,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely,
here's
all
here, here
for it.
here's one I'll throw out. In part, those who obviously this is going to be just lightly edited later on, but for those
Mhm.
who haven't seen our many issues with Zoom in getting this in keeping this meeting going,
Uh-huh.
I mean, what about black here in Champaign and in larger cities, other cities? How about establishing more communication among black leaders to young
Mhm.
black people? That
Mhm.
could come in the form of, say, a Discord group, a Facebook page. What
Okay.
what what specific what specific social media sites are young black Americans here in Champaign on? Let's
Mhm.
get on them and start communicating with them. And
Mhm.
let's leave, let's not take these big bombastic forms for fixing our communities, these big drastic solutions, when there are much smaller things. Just
Mhm.
just opening up that we could do to open up dialogues with young black Americans that
Uh-huh.
could be effective today.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical point. But and that goes back to hearing from the community, and that includes young people,
Hmm.
right? And I think for me, reparations is an intergenerational thing. I think we need all generations to be in the conversation, because their experiences are all different, and they're all affected differently, and they all have different needs at different times in their lives. So yeah, I think that's a critical component of it. And again, I was alluding to it earlier, but there's a lot of issues within the African community that exists because of the harm that was done to us over the years.
Hmm.
You have all kind of behaviors that have been kind of formulated through enslavement, to all kind of things we've been through, the traumatic experiences that we haven't gotten treatment for. I mean, go down the list. There's a lot of pain there. And that pain sometimes translates into lack of communication. Sometimes it translates into a lot of siloing. It translates into, everyone having to do their own thing versus working together. There's a lot of things that have kind of hurt the African community, that are remnants of all that pain and suffering that we went through that we haven't got addressed. And one of the things that Joyce DeGruy in her book talks about is with post-traumatic slave syndrome is that black people went through torture and family separation and humiliation and some things that if you just had one experience one time in your life that you may get treatment for, we've had ongoing for centuries ongoing treatment that we haven't gotten treatment for. So that's going to have a massive effect on how a group of people behaves and interacts with each other and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of work to do even there, in terms of the mental health side of things, and just a recognition of that harm that has a present day effect
Hmm.
on us. So like again, we can go down the list of all these kind of things, but I do believe that, communication, working together intergenerationally, come up with solutions that are again a both and that can do some things now, low cost, minimal cost,
Mhm.
but also looking long term. What are some bigger plans and projects that can happen down the line too? I mean, we do that in everything. Like some people build a home and that's their project. Other people build a skyscraper and that's their project, right?
Mhm.
And so we can be doing both of those things, and thinking about it and working through it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you and I are both young black Americans who are attempting to make our way in this world as well as communicate with the younger generation of black Americans and stop them from having to see or experience a lot of the generational trauma and the systemic issues that we've gone through.
Hmm.
What can we do tomorrow that would help young black Americans? Because
Yeah.
again, I feel like there are just better ways than fighting for the check.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, for one, maybe people may argue that young part for me. I just turned 50. I got two grandkids.
Okay, okay, okay. I'm sorry,
Although
black don't
although I'll
crack, so
take
it's
it.
hard to tell.
I,
It's hard to
I
tell.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. I'll take it though. But yeah, I think one of the key elements is actually education. Like one of the things that you kind of notice among our younger generations
Mhm.
is the lack of that understanding, that knowledge of our own history. And again, that's not accidental either, right? There's current fights about having race-based history in our curriculums, so it's not been accident. I mean, there's so much I did not learn in school
Mhm.
that I had to learn outside of school about our own history. Things, for example, like the Statue of Liberty being completely about the end of slavery and nothing about immigration at all. You discover these things. It's like, really? The Statue of Liberty was for me? And it's evidenced by, if you look into it, everyone can look these things up for themselves.
Mhm.
But the original design of Statue of Liberty didn't have a tablet in their hand; they had shackles. And the original designer of the Statue of Liberty, who was friends of abolitionists of the United States, was basically saying, "Oh, now the United States is a true republic because now they no longer have slavery, and so we're going to celebrate that." And it happened to be the whatever 100th anniversary of the founding of the country, whatever happened. But the whole bring me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry. No, that had nothing to do with the Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty was designed and presented as a congratulations for ending slavery. And the shackles are actually still on the statue, but they're at her feet and not in our arms of the tablet. But you can't see it unless you're like in a helicopter above. But there are shackles at the Statue of Liberty's feet representing that reality and that history. And this history is actually at the Statue of Liberty, where now Joyce DeGruy, who wrote the book Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome, she actually pushed the envelope and managed to get the park rangers to learn that history and share that history in the tours now.
Mhm.
And so there's so much out there. Like I talked about the Revolutionary War being fought in large part because, Leon, historians will say because they wanted to continue slavery in the colonies, which again was actually funny because Britain, who lost the Revolutionary War, they're like, okay, well, we lost. And but we're going to work with you now because we want to take advantage of the fact that you're taking advantage of the slave trade.
Yeah.
Because the United States I mentioned earlier was number two in the world in 1860. And economically speaking, Britain was not number one, and Britain was number one in large part to the United States. And so they still took advantage of it. And even then, how much do we know historically that black folks were offered to fight with the British and were guaranteed freedom if they fought for the British, and about 3,000 black people did, and ultimately did get their freedom after the Revolutionary War, living in Canada and in England and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the majority of black folks who fought for the United States, for the colonies, who were lacklusterly kind of halfway promised some type of freedom, which obviously never occurred, fought for in a war that
Mhm.
basically guaranteed continued enslavement.
It's
um,
true. I don't think anyone doubts the fact that black Americans have suffered. I don't think
mhm.
anybody doubts that. That would be
Some do.
will oh, okay. That would be it would those who do are being willingly naive.
Okay.
That is ridiculous.
Hmm.
However, I still think that our call it reparations, call it whatever you want, should still
Hmm.
come in the form that will be the most effective at empowering the black community. And I am just not convinced yet that the check is what is going to do that when there
Mhm.
are so many good, take for example, you want to get a gastric bypass, you show your uh, you show your doctor you can lose a certain number of pounds ahead of time before
Right.
you do that.
Right.
Perhaps in the black community we should focus on empowerment and building families before we ask for the check and address those things first.
Yeah, but I believe the check could also help that first part in various ways. If you have more resources, then you have less stress. You have less stress, you have better ways to communicate and better overall well-being,
Mm-hmm.
and because when you're stressed out, you at each other, right? When I was a young family man, we had three young children, and it was rough, right? And you tend to take that stress out on each other when the reality is that you're just in a stressful situation, right? And the sooner you can recognize as two individuals that it's just going to be stressful, and therefore the stress is not due to the other person, but is
Mm-hmm.
due to your situation, then you get along, better in that situation, in that environment.
It's
If
true.
you
I
have
mean, would the
resources,
checks have solved that in a world of when, in so many cases of Black Americans, there, it's Americans in general, when in so often, even if they got a check, it would go to paying off a payday loan. It would go toward rampant student debt. It would go toward a mortgage, toward I don't know, maybe I believe some of the people in Evanston actually did put it toward their mortgage. There's it's would this really solve the issues the black community has?
I
Just
think
getting a check in the mail.
Well, I think ongoing significant support can. Like if you get like a $600 check, then who knows, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's not going to change the world. And this is like when people have issue, giving a homeless person $5,
Hmm.
and it's like they're just going to spend on alcohol and smoke and cigarettes. Like what do you expect them to do? Put a down payment for a house with the $5 you gave them? If they could get a little joy out of your $5 by whatever means they're going to get it, then just give you $5 based on you having a heart for them and you want to help.
That's
Don't worry
true. I
how
also
they
have the
deal with
right
it.
to not give him that $5 if I don't want to. And in the
Well,
case of the
absolutely.
taxes that are going toward these reparations, if it would be better off just staying in black Americans' pockets, such as, again, I
Hmm.
do think that perhaps black Chicagoans do have a propensity to buy more from the dispensaries. That is based purely off of, I have no data for that. It's
Hmm.
purely a hunch.
Okay.
But I feel like black Americans could be the ones who paid a disproportionate amount of that money that was then paid to black Americans for
I don't know.
reparations.
It's definitely something to look into. Like I said, research is all about data, right?
Yeah.
But just by sheer population, right? There's just so many more white people than black people, just generally speaking. Like Chicago's still only about 33% black. As black
Mm.
as people think Chicago is, it's still only a third of the population.
But they
So
made it a tax on weed. Like, come on. There's got to be you're really gonna say there's nothing ironic about that, about the fact that black Americans are being taxed to fund social programs for black American. It is this, and that's a
yeah.
problem in Illinois in general. Like, this is
Uh-huh.
like we're framing this like in the black this issue with the black community, an issue with the way the government treats the black community. We're talking about reparations as a microcosm of
Mhm.
the corruption in Illinois. Why are we going for big grandiose ideas here? Why are we going for reparations when we could just eliminate this funding merry-go-round
Yeah.
that
Well,
is.
one form of reparations could be that black people cannot have to pay the tax for marijuana. You're right. That'll solve that problem.
I mean, maybe we just shouldn't tax marijuana so heavily in general, and trust that that will probably help black Americans. And we
Well,
don't need
well,
to necessarily like ID people at the door, figure out if
right.
they're black or not.
Well, here's the thing, so in Germany, if you live in Germany today
Hmm.
and you work a job and you pay taxes in Germany, some of your tax dollar goes towards victims of Jewish people who were victimized in Holocaust and so on and so forth.
Well, I mean, Germany
It's
is a recently occupied country. I mean, Germany was occupied by a combination of the Americans and the Soviets up until 50 years ago, maybe, like
right,
just under direct military
right.
occupation.
But
And
that today they're still paying reparations. Like I
Yeah, I
ran
mean
into
that influenced their culture of the people and what their government sees as important and not important. I mean,
right. And therefore they pay reparations. There's a professor from Barbados, Sir William Will Beckles, I think his name. He was sharing how he talks to parliaments all over the world about reparations, including African nations and so on and so forth. And one day, this Jewish woman came to him and said, "Hey, would you like to see a reparations check?" He's like, "Sure, I've never seen one before." So this 81-year-old Jewish woman showed him her reparations check that she was getting, that she had been receiving since 1946, right? Because our parents were killed in the Holocaust, and so that money
Jesus
came
Christ.
from the German art, the German tax dollars. That again, if I lived in Germany today and I worked in Germany, my tax dollars will be going towards that fund to help pay for her reparations, right? And so that's the concept that we need. I believe we need to have United States, that this country has done this harm,
Mm.
and regardless of who you are, you pay into it by being a person in this country, paying taxes in this country. You are just by default going to contribute to that past, to that history.
That's
And,
true. But
and
I mean, like, I feel like it should take the form that is going to help the black community the most, not the form that is, being pushed specifically in part by government actors. Again, Brandon Johnson is very much in favor of reparations. I know few black leaders across America who aren't. I
Mhm.
mean, it's and it. I still am just fixated on the idea that these reparations, or whatever you want to call them, should come in the form that's most effective at
Mhm.
helping the black community, not
Yeah.
in the form that is being specifically pushed by the government. And exactly why is the government pushing for this solution specifically, where they can take tax dollars from marijuana to buy off black Americans? It seems like a bizarre system when it's broken down.
Yeah, and I agree that it shouldn't just be that shouldn't be the sole source. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think that just like other things that we need to come up with money for, that we find money for, we need to find money beyond the marijuana tax sales for this as well. And again, I think the jury is out in terms of how to do that best. I think we have to try some stuff out, whether it be zero low cost to highly invested dollars. We need to try everything out and see what is best. I just don't think we have that data yet.
Mm-hmm.
When they did minimum basic income in Houston, where people were getting $1,000 a month for a year, and again, this was just any low income individual, they found that a majority of that money went towards people stabilizing their housing situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of some kind of empirical information about what people may do with ongoing financial support. And again, how does that translate? Well, again, if your housing situation is more stable, now you can maybe focus your attention on other things. Maybe you can spend more time helping your child with their homework, or maybe you can go and relax and enjoy a park nearby and have less stress and have a healthier heart. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
we don't know how all these things may translate, but again, we need to just try it out and see. you know.
I mean, is we need to try it out and see a good reason to hand out checks?
I
Like,
think we
especially
don't
if
don't
tax dollars. I don't
know.
know. I'm not sure that is a great reason to do so.
Well, I don't think we know what the best way to do it is until we try it, right? Because otherwise we'll never know if we don't try it.
Okay.
And that's
Well, I mean,
how
let's try the free
experimentation is
solutions
done.
first.
I'm all for both.
Okay.
And again, my emphasis for both is this country again highly benefited not just by free programs, they benefited specifically financially
Mm.
from this harm from this history. And I don't see any problem with wanting the part of the solution to get funds from that benefit that they had. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's just, for example, if you personally worked a job and you didn't get paid for a month, right? Would you say, well, here's my situation. I'm down and out because I've been working all this time but I haven't gotten paid for a month. So let me find some free solution to how to make my life better. Or would you want your paycheck?
I mean, that can
You
be
know what I'm
true,
saying?
and also doesn't make the welfare state effective at actually uplifting people out of poverty. So putting more money into the systems of the welfare state, into IDHS, various other groups, offices, whatnot that are running Illinois, that are sucking up all these tax dollars. I mean, just they would be the ones who would be doing a lot of this work. as they have
Mhm.
also handed out a lot of the money to um, speakers who have gone around the state and spoken about reparations.
Well, and the thing about the welfare system, we got first of all realize that there's more white people benefit from welfare than black people just by sheer population, right?
It's true,
You
yeah.
know, and given the whole talk about cutting Medicaid, and even I even saw the other day they're even talking about cutting Medicare now, even, but this $1 trillion of Medicaid and other benefits, first of all, is like the amount of money you can cut from these programs is not anything compared to the tax cuts you're giving towards the wealthiest. But let's look at the Medicaid program specifically. 88% of the money for regular Medicaid, not the states that have expanded Medicaid, but just regular Medicaid, 88% of the money goes towards three vulnerable groups: children, people with disabilities, and elderly who are dual eligible for Medicare and Medicaid because they're low income. Only even though 24% of those on Medicaid are working age adults, they only consume 12% of the money because they're generally healthy people,
Mm.
right? But you have these cuts being proposed, and 88% of the dollars are being spent for those three vulnerable groups.
Mm-hmm.
Why would this country, with any conscience whatsoever, be okay with cutting healthcare for those three vulnerable groups?
So there might be more effective ways and more
But they're not
culturally and
proposing
physically effective
alternatives.
means of helping them.
But they're not proposing any alternatives to helping them. They're just wanting to cut. And so the reason why
Is
these
that
cuts
here
are
in Illinois?
no, that's the nation. That's the federal plan. For
Okay.
they already passed a House by one vote. They had one vote over to pass in the
Are
House.
you talking about specifically the big beautiful bill? I
Yes, and the
believe.
Senate is looking at it now. Right.
Okay. Well, I mean, but
So,
here on the state level, though, we are we're already paying insane levels of taxes. We're already paying insane I mean we have all those programs. I feel like the most effective thing for us to do with this last 10 minutes here would be to specifically talk about, again, we are both individuals, black men living in Champaign, in Illinois. How do you think, what do you, how do you think young people can get involved on the municipal and state level to start having their voices be known?
yeah, I think one of the key is community organizing,
Mm-hmm.
because that should, if it's done well, should impact the political side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can get engaged in that political side of things and then be part of that, right? And so you get your education, you find out you get the knowledge that you need, by being around your elders and your, so on and so forth. And you engage in the system, you engage in the process, and then you become part of the leadership in making those future decisions. I think that's the key kind of avenue to do that. Um, I think that the knowledge piece is so vital, just to kind of just not just for Black history, but just to understanding how the world works. You know what I mean? Because it changes all the time, and it's constantly moving, and so it,
Mm-hmm.
it takes some time to really just capture that. So then when you do engage on those levels and you do go to the council meetings and the county board meetings and you start hopefully becoming one of those leaders yourself, you at least are knowledgeable about those kind of things, because it will impact how you make your decisions. It will impact the kind of legislation and policies you decide to support and pass.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the key part is let's find a way to come together as Black folks and share that knowledge.
Okay,
Uh,
well let's spend this last couple of minutes brainstorming. What are those? How do we do that?
I've been trying to, we've hired these two young ladies for our Healing and the Grant thing, and part one of them has a lot of connections with the U of I,
Mm-hmm.
been talking to a lot of U of I groups and so on and so forth. So we're just trying to spread the word about what our coalition is doing and trying to get engaged as much as we can with the younger people about that.
What sorts of
Uh,
things are you doing?
well, having an event like we had with the town hall,
Mm-hmm.
trying to get folks on it. Again, we're going to get a lot of students there because it's the summer. But the idea is that we can keep having those kind of things. We do plan on talking to the UIUC faculty and doing other things with the student government there to, again, have opportunities to inform young people about the situation and, let them make the minds up for themselves, but at least let them have all the information so
Mm-hmm.
they can have that to make up their minds. And so, yeah, so those kind of things we're going to try to do is just kind of be much more integrated with the U of I, and then even locally outside of U of I. I do work with very church groups,
What sorts of
Minister
church groups?
Alliance. Minister Alliance. I've been to a couple of their. I've actually made announcements and presentation at a couple of their meetings to a number of African American churches and communities, both here in Champaign-Urbana and like even in Danville and some other places that come to a once a month breakfast.
Mhm.
And so we're trying to, get to Black folks and the younger Black folks through those vehicles and means.
Do you think that a once a month breakfast is the best way to get a hold of young Black Americans?
There's some who come to that breakfast. It's not the definitely not probably the ideal vehicle, but we'll have to kind of figure out what are some possible ways to reach them.
Well, let's think
We
about that.
know,
What about a forming a group on the most find? Well, first of all, what about finding out the most popular social media sites with young Black people? I thought about doing like a poll at the local schools, maybe.
yeah, and then like I said, or utilizing like the young people we have in our group to kind of figure it out too. Like at our reparation town hall, I got my second cousin from younger generation and his wife doing all of our live Facebook Live, whatever, however way you do that, right?
Yeah.
So we have access to people who are in that realm who are very active on social media. Has their Twitter and all the other kind of stuff going on and Instagram and what have you, and really trying to get them more engaged. Yeah, and I know social media is like one of the key elements to doing that. So yeah, so we do have some links to the younger generations. Just as a 50-year-old, like I literally don't even have any social media other than like a Facebook and LinkedIn account.
No,
So
yeah, but I mean that's it's but it's so key if we really want to fix these issues. That if we want to open up that communication, it's
mhm,
so key to reaching them.
I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah.
And just for me, I want as many people, Black kids especially, and young people especially, but anybody, I want them more knowledgeable about these kind of things because I think it's just going to help our society as a whole down the line by having more knowledge, having more information, because it really does influence what you do and how you determine things. And those people are going to be people who are making decisions that's going to dictate things in other people's lives, so you want them to be equipped with that information. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. I mean, we blew past that 1 hour, but thank you for sitting with.
That's
Thank you for
fine.
having this conversation with me
I love
first and
talking about these
foremost.
kind of things.
I feel like this was a
Absolutely.
great conversation. This was awesome.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And keep the dialogue going and keep this kind of thing up. And, hopefully you can share that with young people and they can hear it.
I mean, that's
And
the goal. That is the
yeah.
goal. Yeah. That is 100% the goal with this is that outreach. So before we do a little bit of an outro, like what are you doing? Where can people find you? Where can people reach you? Like do the whole plug. Give us the whole spiel.
Absolutely. So for me, I would love anybody who is willing to be part of our coalition, Champaign County, Champaign-Urbana Reparations Coalition, and that will give people information about our monthly meetings that we have every third Thursday, 6:30 p.m. at New Covenant Fellowship, located at 124 West White Street in Champaign. And we also can get you on the email list when you sign up. We don't bombard people with emails. We know how that goes. So we basically kind of send out a couple, 2 or 3 a month to tell people about the meetings coming up, maybe the day before the meeting and then like after the meeting with the minutes, things that took place. We also do have, we're on Zoom for every meeting as well. So you can get plugged in. You don't have to show up to the church in order to participate. You can log in and be on Zoom.
I'm gonna be honest with you. If you want to connect with young Black people, Discord and Twitch. You need those two.
All right. And so just basically kind of get an account and be able to have that available like we have Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I don't know about the Twitch stuff. I'll have to confer with the younger people.
Yeah,
group.
It's got a reputation, but if you want young Black people watching genuinely, get yourself out there, like on the social media sites that don't feel like they're specifically made for politics. It's going to be very, very important that our political institutions are able to engage with people, as well as being more than political institutions, but also cultural. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me, Dr. Trask. Incredible to talk to you. And I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there.